Okay, Eric, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast for another time.
Johnny, always a pleasure.
It's great. If people haven't listened to the other three episodes you've been on, could you just give people a brief introduction to who you are, what it is you do, why we should listen to you, that kind of thing?
Absolutely. I always like to tell people about myself and why I'm worth listening to. No, but in all seriousness, I am a research fellow at the Auckland University of Technology in the areas of strength and conditioning and sports physiology and nutrition. And I personally am someone who is very interested in the sports science behind strength and physique sport. So I'm the scientific advisor for 3D Muscle Journey. Also was a longtime coach and now very part-time coach with them, one of the co-founders. And that's just basically our community support of the drug-free lifting community. So primarily I work with drug-free strength athletes and bodybuilders. But of course that means that I've, done a lot of research study and have a decent amount of experience in the areas of anything related to nutrition, psychology, periodization, and programming as it relates to the outcomes that would be important for those folks. I was a personal trainer for years, did some personal training education, but then I've become, more specialized over time. I lift weights myself. It's, a huge hobby of mine. Probably hobby is putting it too lightweight, but huge obsession of mine. That's probably more accurate.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so yeah, that's me.
Yeah, you've had a very interesting, like, if people follow your kind of personal journey through weightlifting and sports, you've done competitive bodybuilding, you've done competitive powerlifting, you've even had a bit of a string of Olympic weightlifting as well.
I've done a bit of that. Yes, yes.
Did
Not
you find
nearly
it?
to the competence level of the other ones, but yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, was that like a brief? Hey, I want to try something new. How did that go for you?
It wasn't that brief. So I did Olympic weightlifting and I started training for it in 2011 and 12 to get an understanding of the movements because I've always really respected it and I love it. It's my favorite part of the Olympics.
Yeah.
Um, and I've always thought it was the most technically impressive movements you can do with a barbell,
Mhm.
um, and achieved a measure of competence there. But continued on as a powerlifter and bodybuilder. And then in 2013 and 14, I was like, you know what, I really want to commit to doing this. And I worked with Adam Story here in New Zealand, who's um, a two-time New Zealand Olympic coach, actually, having gone to the Olympics. And I worked with him for a solid couple of years and was part of North Sport Olympic weightlifting and got up to around like a 200 kilo total, but I was still very immobile and trying to powerlift at the same time. And I didn't feel like I had, I guess, crossed all my T's and dotted all my I's. So I came back to it I guess it was, yeah, just last year. I did a couple more comps and felt that I had improved technically a lot more. So that was another really good stint. I worked with another guy named Stas Chileyev, a good friend of mine, who's a great Olympic weightlifting coach and silver medalist in the Commonwealth Games.
Oh,
And
he's all right then.
yeah, he's all right. Yeah, no, he's fantastic coach, and
Yeah.
I would say that as much as I love Olympic weightlifting, I am definitely have some physical limitations, which I feel like give me a relatively low ceiling to where I can go with it. But I love it. So yeah, well, I'll probably be cyclically coming back to it in some measure, but certainly I'm a little more interested in the static, more broy stuff. Yeah.
Which sometimes could then cause that limitation for the Olympic weightlifting in terms of but they're difficult movements, as you said.
Indeed. Apparently, it's helpful if you can fully extend your elbows. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, kind of, but also one of the easiest things to injure in such lift.
true.
But yeah, they're like a mastery movement, aren't they? That you just spend a long time. Like as you said, they're the most complex ones. So they're just
Indeed.
super fun to practice. But
Absolutely.
talking about habits for long-term health and fitness, what would you say are you've been lifting now for what, like many years? What would you say are your favorite habits to build into health and fitness for people?
I think it's almost like an assumption with most of the people I work with that they're going to train. Like if I don't get my client a program, which means I haven't done my job, but let's say something happens, They go on vacation, I don't hear from them, or, they get a change in circumstance and they have to quit coaching all of a sudden. When I was a personal trainer, I knew in those situations, they were probably not going to be training. Like, if they're not coming into my office, they're probably not going to work out. And obviously that was something I was working towards changing and trying to get them to do some work on their own, and making, the habits more permanent. But when you're working with strength athletes and bodybuilders, I just know that they're going to be training on something else than what I told them. So the training is what they do. And I was brought in to enhance it. I wasn't brought in to help them develop the habit of lifting. Mm-hmm. So I think that is something where it is probably the most important habit, being physically active. I think COVID is something that has made us acutely aware of that. And I think sometimes we take this overly mathematical view of how physical activity can impact, health and body composition. That, if you're physically active, it builds these specific qualities. It's also the energy in, energy out. It's the energy outside of that equation. So, during COVID, no one's moving. So, we're losing some of those adaptations. So we're not as good of fitness, and everyone's tired of split squats. And we're not burning as many calories because we're stuck in our living room. Right.
Yeah.
And it's a little more complex than that. I think if you look at some of the data that's out there on people who are effectively able to maintain their lost weight over longer periods of time, so we're talking years, it's probably not coming down to math. It's not just that they have mastered the energy balance equation and they're eating less than they're taking in. They are, of course, on net, or they wouldn't have maintained the lost weight.
Yeah.
But there's an interesting study that I'm currently reviewing for Mass, where they found that people who are currently maintaining lost weight are still inaccurate in estimating their caloric intake to a similar degree as people who are overweight and are not maintaining that lost weight. And the thing that typically correlates with successful weight loss maintenance is maintaining a high level of activity. So people who didn't just exercise for the purpose of getting to an outcome of saying losing weight or getting healthier, but then that became a regular practice of theirs. They became someone who lifts, or whatever, CrossFits, swims, runs, plays soccer, doesn't matter. That, they had become the person who, when they have to take a week off personal training, they're training on their own. And that's just what they do. And there's a lot of reasons beyond the math as to why that probably has a much more powerful effect than other habits, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point to start us off with, because there becomes a lot of debate of that whole exercise. Do you need it? Weight loss coming down to the energy balance side of the equation, as you mentioned there, like energy in versus energy out. But you're saying, well, actually, activity not just manages that energy outside of the equation, but there's probably some deeper things going on, whether that's extra health-seeking behaviors because of the activity, or whether it's that, increased muscle tissue also helping burn more calories. It's a very complex landscape, I guess.
Yeah, and there's a few things that I think most people don't consider on that list. Right. So, one of them is the work that's been done showing that being sedentary, not having that activity in place, and that's kind of the way it is in the modern world. That if you're not actively exercising and you live in a first world country, especially in the West, where there's maybe not quite as much public transportation. I'm speaking more, less applies to say like living in London and more so anywhere in the States and say Canada or Australia or New Zealand, where we're not quite as good at it. But where walking is just not as frequently as done. You will find that if you don't exercise, you fit into what would be categorized as sedentary. And there's a lot of data out showing that sedentary individuals have less control over satiety and hunger. It's less finely tuned. You see a dysregulation between energy intake and energy output. And it doesn't require much, but once you start ticking up regular levels of activity, and that could be quantified in step counts, that work's been done, or it can be quantified as the hours spent being sedentary, things change metabolically. When you give someone a challenge test, so you look at area under the curve of blood glucose and blood triglycerides, even if you just exercised. Let's say you did an hour of hard exercise. If in the previous days you were sedentary, you will have a poorer performance on the ability to sequester glucose and triglyceride from the blood. So the metabolic health is poorer in someone who's sedentary, even when they occasionally exercise, kind of showing that effect. And then, like I said, that the long-term outcomes is that if you look at office workers versus people who are low, moderate, and highly active in their jobs, you see on average, a maintenance of body weight with an increase in calories that match expenditure until you get to the sedentary person, and they seem to overeat. So that's what's called the J-shaped curve of energy intake and activity. So there's an indirect effect, which is quite important on your activity levels, on metabolic health, and subsequently on hunger, satiety, and passive food consumption, which I think a lot of people don't think about. It's the problem is you're just eating more than you need to maintain weight, but why, right? And I think people don't realize how those things factor in. Johnny, one thing you said I think is really important is, we often talk about, hey, like activity, you don't have to do cardio to lose weight. But I think that whole perspective is a different one than what we're talking about. Saying, hey, during weight loss, you probably want to do a little bit of cardio and stay active and do the exercise you need to get the fitness outcomes you want and to build muscle and all those other great things that come from exercise. But instituting a calorie deficit, you need to make these nutritional habit changes. That can still be true in the face of what we're saying, because it is a very challenging thing to do to try to lose weight completely from exercise. You find yourself almost overtraining, especially if the intensity of that exercise is very high. And you can definitely find endurance athletes who are, struggle to lose weight, or people who do a sufficient amount of exercise like that. So when it comes to, okay, now I'm thinking of in terms of this is a 12-week diet, you probably do want to follow some of those heuristics that you'll hear me repeat, like, primarily manipulate nutrition and then supplement it with cardio. But that's a very different conversation than what do I need to do to permanently maintain a lower body fat and a healthier body weight? And that looks a lot more like maintaining a constant daily practice of activity to get all those other knock-on effects, because it's not about trying to lose weight. It's about living life without seeing your weight creep back up, without you intentionally, trying to have that happen.
Yeah, because everyone thinks about the initial period of like losing weight. It becomes like a fixated term, rather than actually thinking, how do I then maintain it for the long haul? And where exercise or activity can fit perfectly in. And there are a couple of things that you mentioned. I mean, the sort of like person who trains almost too much, or the endurance athlete who struggles to lose weight. Really interesting. Really want to dig into that. But before that, because we're on this sort of activity to lose weight, yay or nay, you mentioned, you don't need to do cardio to lose weight, but maybe supplement a bit into it. And in your mind, Eric, and I mean, you've read a lot of data as well, when it comes, everyone talks about like, the best exercise to lose fat. And it's like, the one you can stick to. But would you say that there is a particular case for some type of weight-bearing exercise because of the benefits of building muscle tissue, stronger bones, increased metabolic function, burning more calories at rest, that kind of thing?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I think ideally there should be some form of resistance exercise in there, because that has specific effects on, building bone density. Like the best way to, there's basically two ways through exercise which you can effectively build bone density. There's impact, like running, jumping, playing sport. And then there is hard contractions. Because if you think about what happens when the muscle shortens, like what is the muscle pulling on? Tendon. What is the tendon attached to? Muscle. Sometimes we think like I've got to be doing squats and deadlifts and axial loading and heavy weights to build bone density. But if you do, a set of 10 to failure, you're still producing pretty high forces when you look at that muscle, and it's tugging on the bone. And when you look at people who lift weights, it is, I would argue, probably the best form of, anti-osteoporosis we have out there. So, and for anyone who is, modifying their energy intake with the goal of trying to lose body fat for health or any reason, if you don't have some type of stimulus to maintain muscle mass, you're going to lose not only fat mass tissue and predominantly fat mass tissue, but also lean mass tissue, because there's not necessarily a stimulus to keep it there.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially, I think anyone who, even if they're not interested, like I don't want to be muscular, I don't really like lifting weights, it's like, that's fine. And I would agree in those cases that whatever is something you enjoy and will keep doing, and you can make a daily practice, that's what you should do. And, cherry on top, if it includes multiple domains of fitness, I would say the same thing from a different perspective on someone who really only liked like heavy lifting and trained like 3 times a week, but just did like triples. Like, can we do something for your cardiovascular health as well? And I actually have done a couple of video series and articles in Mass recently, where I've talked about, I'm asking the question, is lifting enough? And I've reviewed some of the data that would suggest that if you are someone who is sedentary outside of sport or outside of lifting, that can have some obviously less negative effects than being sedentary all the time and not exercising. But there are slightly different effects of being active and being sedentary. And it's not that they're not on the same sliding scale, except in terms of the time that you have available in your day. There are independent negative effects, unfortunately, from being sedentary, and there are independent positive effects from exercising that affect some of the same outcomes. So it's more like one impacts the other, and you see the net benefit. So if you are someone who trains, let's say 1 hour, 3 days a week with weights, but you're entirely sedentary outside of that, one doesn't cancel the other out. They both have this effect on you. And that may be the person who is still struggling, despite the fact that they're doing what on paper is associated with the successful maintenance of lost weight. They're doing the exercise, but they're still struggling to maintain lost weight, or they're struggling not to gain weight. That could be part of the reason, and that their hunger is dysregulated at other points in the day. Their metabolic health isn't great. And they've got these little windows of exercise, but the vast majority of their day-to-day life is described as was probably being sedentary. So I think you do have to kind of apply this on an individual basis. What might be best for the diet might look a little different for maintenance, and what looks best for some person who regularly exercises, but let's say has a sedentary job, is going to be different than someone who regularly exercises, doesn't have a sedentary job, but perhaps doesn't have a great relationship with food, which is a whole other can of worms, and all of those things are to some degree potentially possible in some kind of permutation in any individual person you're working with. And you can't expect activity just because it tracks with what weight loss maintenance success looks like in the research to be the solution for each person who is struggling to maintain lost weight, but it may be a factor.
Yeah, well, and it comes back to that, what you mentioned earlier, that J-shaped curve of people who are more sedentary seem to have higher appetites than people who have that kind of moderate level of exercise and activity. And you brought up a few times the difference between someone with a sedentary job and a moderately active job. Someone with a moderately active job will probably get away with a few weight sessions a week, 3 to 4, and someone who's much more sedentary might need to add in more steps or cardio or even just more lifting sessions to get more of those hits of activity through the week. And obviously super interesting bringing in the relationship with food piece as well, which can often get overlooked with a very scientific black and white look of things sometimes. Can be very much a world of grey. If we double back to when you mentioned about the endurance athlete or someone who trains a lot who might then struggle to lose fat, talk to us a little bit about the dynamics there, because obviously a lot of people will just think, oh, well, more fitness, that's going to cure my problem. Like, energy out, let's just hammer it. But is that from a increased appetite, so struggling to adhere to lower calorie thing? Is it a lack of recovery and therefore not losing fat type thing because actually they're overtraining? Is it a combination of the two? What does the research and I guess your experience say on that?
Well, there's not a ton of research on it, at least that I'm aware of. But my experience tells me that most people who approach, keeping fat loss off with, I need to basically become just a fitness enthusiast all the time. A lot of the times that's because they don't know how to handle the nutrition side of it. That's a very challenging or scary thing or something they failed with in the past. So they go, you know what, look, I can't control that. Like, oof, let's put that in a box, lock it away. I don't like myself and my food behaviors. Like that part of my life is something I don't like looking at. It's challenging. I've tried to do it before. It failed. It hurt my self-efficacy. But you know what? If I'm training 2 hours a day, how could that not, fix that problem? And what typically happens is they see a measure of success, and they get in great shape. Don't get me wrong, in terms of like actual fitness outcomes, they're not sedentary, but the relationship with food is still wanting. So I think that I brought that up just to kind of point out, like, hey, just because there's this J-shaped curve doesn't mean that we can forget about individual differences. And I think this is I think the research on intuitive eating and some of the non-dieting strategies is really interesting here, in so much as they are not diet strategies. They are a response to the fact that in this push to combat the obesity epidemic and the types of diets that have come out, I don't have to tell you or your listeners about all the terrible things that are in the diet industry. No. And all of the and I mean, and not even just the methods being like super low calorie or fasting or just eat juice or take this harmful supplement. That's all there as well, but also the psychological messaging behind it. And there's a large amount of shame associated with not looking the way you're supposed to, quote unquote. And I think, that there's a reason why there's been a lot of people who have been, advocating against, fat shaming or weight stigma or things like this. So as at least in part a consequence of pushing very hard to get people smaller, as a response to the obesity epidemic, there have been a lot of people who have, in the process of trying to do so, have developed an unhealthy relationship with their body and or food. And now we need interventions to help them with that. And so I think one of the things that is often frustrating when you look at conversations about weight neutral approaches, intuitive eating, mindful eating, all these things, is that they're often looked at from the perspective, okay, well, how can this be a tool in our journey for weight loss? And they are specifically not tools for the journey of weight loss. They are tools that were born out of the collateral damage from our societal approach to weight loss. So I think many times they are probably the most appropriate step in cases where someone has been burned by their attempts to lose weight. And repairing that relationship with food, repairing that relationship with their body, and focusing on health-seeking nutrition behaviors and getting a better awareness of hunger or satiety. The data right now would suggest that these weight neutral approaches do seem to improve markers for health. They do seem to improve psychological well-being, and they do seem to result in weight neutral outcomes, meaning not gaining weight, not necessarily losing weight either. So they are a potentially very viable solution, especially if someone is on board with training. And the piece of the puzzle, like I was saying before, in that kind of archetypal description that is intimidating, potentially traumatic from previous experiences, is their relationship with food. I think that's probably a good entry point. Like, look, we're not going to try to diet. We're going to do something very different. And we're going to work on, hey, we think we have at least the activity part sorted to where your physiological signals for hunger and satiety aren't going to be dysregulated from being sedentary. This might be a good time for us to now start to improve our relationship with food and start to notice when we're physically hungry, how we physically feel, and do some of the things that are kind of those key elements of what's associated with intuitive eating, quote unquote, honoring your hunger. So being aware of when you're starting to feel full, being aware of how foods do or don't serve you. You might feel like you really wanted to eat a whole lot of donuts because they're delicious. And maybe you were stressed, but did it actually help you with your stress, or did you feel worse afterwards? Did you actually like the way your body felt? Did you feel heavier? Did you have worse or better gastrointestinal distress? So that kind of awareness, it takes you out of the moment. It gives you some space to think and notice your body. And the research would suggest that people change their behavior for the better when they do that, even if the intent is not necessarily, well, I don't want to eat a bunch of donuts because they're high in calories. It might be, I don't want to eat a bunch of donuts because it didn't actually make me feel better for more than an hour. And then I actually felt worse the rest of the day, either through self-judgment, which I need to work on, or, because my digestive tract was like, whoa, it's a lot of donuts. So I think that's just one little example, but it's one I like to use, in that a lot of people, when they are confronted with some of these weight neutral approaches, they go, well, just, eating when you're hungry and stopping when you're full hasn't worked previously. And it's a very simplistic straw man of what some of these approaches actually are.
Yeah, because there is a very different it's a very different landscape to really work on someone's relationship with food and really recover, I guess, standard hunger and appetite signaling for someone that's got a messed up relationship with food, or someone who's got to that stage of overweight and obesity. Whereas a lot, as you said, that a lot of the time it would be emotional, a lot of the time it would be due to stress, a lot of the time it would be due to other reasons other than physical hunger. But there is also that landscape, the hunger and appetite can get skewed the further that way you get, I guess, and then add in inactivity to the mix as well. Like, with that J-shaped curve we just talked about, it does become a very complex landscape. But interesting that you said, well, actually a weight neutral approach like intuitive eating or like mindful eating, and adding in self-compassion, which is becoming more and more important in these because of that whole shame, guilt leading to more overeating. Let's fix the relationship with food first, and then when things are kind of squared away into a better place, now we can start actually moving more towards a dieting strategy if the person wants to / needs to, I guess, is kind of where we're looking at here.
That's well said. I think that last part is really, really important. I think it puts it should put a lot of power back in the person's hands, who maybe previously they were dieting because of expectations, either that they were putting on themselves or that they feel were put on them, or some combination of the two. And out of a sense of not being good enough, being unacceptable, typically having a lot of shame and negative self-talk around it. And if they can get to that place of self-compassion and accepting and appreciating their body for the good things it has, the fact that it keeps them alive every day, that they are able to, like in this example, go do all this exercise, that they're in great shape, even if, it's not necessarily the way they have at times want it to look. Being able to shift that perspective, now all of a sudden they can decide, okay, with me actually in the driver's seat, not operating out of shame and guilt and pressure, do I want to diet? And that's a very different proposition than I have to diet. I'm a bad person if I don't diet. Every day I'm sitting in a body that makes me feel not good enough. Therefore, I must diet. And I think it has to come from the person. They have to get to a place where dieting is not a scary proposition of a potential repeated traumatic experience, but something they want to gift themselves, step into. They're willing to try it. They're willing to risk, because it is a risk. Trying to diet, it may or may not be successful, and that can erode or build self-efficacy. And we know the rates of success aren't great, So I think you have to look at, what's most likely to do potential benefit to someone. And I would say, all right, well, let's sort things from a fitness perspective, an activity perspective. Let's make sure that, at least as far as we can tell, there should be the appropriate regulation of hunger and satiety. All right, well, now the next step is, let's actually build the person's awareness of when the satiety and hunger signals are in the place they should be. And let's heal their relationship with food and their body. And let's put them in the driver's seat rather than being reactive to the self-judgment. Let's get them that self-compassion you talked about, Johnny. And then we go, hey, next step is yours, whatever you want to do. And if what they decide is, I would like to diet, okay, then we try to support them in that. And if they go, you know what, I'm active, I'm healthy, I have a good relationship with food, I've improved, and typically, intuitive eating comes with qualitative improvements in diet, and it does have objective improvements in physical health. So like, quote unquote, worst case scenario, if you're looking at this purely from the perspective of how do we get people's body weight down, the worst case outcome there is someone is now regularly physically active, not sedentary, eating a healthy diet, is much better psychological relationship with food and themselves, happier, and probably has far better health markers in every case. And there is there's no more impetus for them to lose weight or change their body unless they want to. And then you can kind of look at it kind of like, hey, do you want to get a tattoo? Sweet, I support you in that. Like, cool body mod, man. And that's kind of the way, I view like bodybuilding. If someone wants to get bigger pecs, I think it's awesome.
Cool.
I'll support you.
Yeah. Each their own with what they want to do with their body, right? Because it's completely theirs, and it's really cool to talk about it. This, bringing back that self-compassion piece, because it's, as you said, there's such an expectation on how people should look, and it's from social media, it's from fitness magazines, and it's from a lot of outside pressures that, unfortunately, there's just there's those two worlds, isn't it? Of like, as you said, if someone wants to bodybuild and look great in front of a fitness magazine, that's great. But now we have people who feel pressured to do that because of the world we live in, where we're constantly comparing ourselves to other people. And I think what I wanted to ask you then, Eric, was that, we've talked a little bit about weight neutral strategies like intuitive eating and building sort of healthier habits. And I love how you then start with the fitness piece, because it's like, if you build an activity of being physically fit and build that as a habit for life, then, even if you are quote unquote a little bit overweight, metabolically, you can be very healthy. And then if we look at intuitive eating, weight neutral strategies, where we heal your relationship with food first, you're probably going to be eating more vegetables, you're going to be eating more nutrient dense foods, you're going to be eating fewer processed foods, because a lot of the overeating of those foods comes from the guilt shame cycle from rigid dieting strategies and a poor relationship with food. So I guess my question would be for you, Eric, because I think if we get real deep down into hunger and satiety, and someone's probably from a more overweight position, and you've got fitness, you've got hunger and satiety coming in, they're probably going to drop some pounds naturally, maybe stall out somewhere based on their kind of natural, genetics and body shape, and also if they've come from quite a large place. If someone's to then say, okay, now I want to diet, what would their starting steps be to then not refuel that poor relationship with food?
Yeah, that's a very tough one. And I think I don't have any hard science to back this up, but I think there should probably be a phasic approach to this. If someone is, we'll just throw some numbers at it just to kind of give some perspective here. If someone is hanging around, like say 50% body fat, and we use that example I gave before, maybe they were not actually intending, like maybe they have the goal long-term of losing weight, but they've been focusing on the process of becoming someone who exercises. And they're that person we've talked about who now exercises on average, let's say 8 to 10 hours a week. And they've implemented activity into their lifestyle so that they go on walks, they take the stairs, they do all the things, so that even though they have a sedentary job and they live in, the UK or the US, they're not sedentary anymore. And then, like you said, they've gone through the process of trying to heal their relationship with food in their body and their history and the way they see food, and they've developed self-compassion, all that. It's hard to think of all those steps being done and that person not now having lost a significant amount of weight, even if it wasn't the explicit intention.
Yeah.
So then now this person is doing great by all objective and all important standards. Now it's hard to think that person's blood work would show them as, being diabetic or having, metabolic markers that are outside of normal ranges. It's possible they could be. It really does, like you said, depend on genetics, or it could be, pre-diabetic or pre-hypertension or something like that. But it's more likely that they are pretty healthy now, with all the things that they've made changes to. And I think at this point, if they want to lose further weight, we'll put another number on. Let's say they're down to 35% body fat, but highly active, all those good things, everything's in normal ranges. If they want to get leaner, I think the first thing is I would want to see them really establish a clear why, and then make sure that it was something that was attached to positive reasons. There's a cool review another review I did in Mass, and I promise I'm not just trying to plug my research review, but
there'll be a link, Eric. Don't worry, there'll be
yeah,
a link.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
But anyway, there was an assessment of successful New Year's resolutioners and non-successful New Year's resolutioners, and probably the strongest relationship that kind of cut across groups and different interventions was that approach-oriented goals were better than avoidance-oriented goals. And what that means is exactly what it sounds like, that you're trying to approach something. You're not trying to remove something. So it's very difficult to frame in avoidance terms weight loss that doesn't kind of feel icky. Like, I want to lose weight. I want to not be, like, if you think about all the things you don't want to be, that carries this stigma of like, I'm kind of shitty right now. I want to fix that,
Yeah.
So, however, if you frame things with approach-oriented goals, all of a sudden there's not the implicit statement at the baseline of where I currently am at is crap, that it needs to be changed, but rather I would really like to move towards something. This is about growth and improvement rather than a correction or punishment of the current issue. So I think framing it in approach-oriented terms, like I would love to do X, Y, and Z, and focusing on the process rather than just the outcomes. Those are things that are associated with more likelihood of success. And then going back to what I said with it being phasic, I think someone in this position would have probably learned that, I developed these habits that stuck with me, that got me to a place where I wanted to make a change in my life over years. It was the way I was raised in my family. It was the social media environment that I grew up in. It was the pressures that I felt growing up. It was some of the shame I developed, and whatever my life experiences were. And here I am. And it took me a while before I was now someone exercising 8 hours a week, not, changing my diet, my relationship with food, changing my perspectives, reframing all that stuff, everything we talked about. That's a multi-year process.
Yeah.
Likewise, if I want to now get from 35% body fat to, let's say, in the 20s, and maintain that for the rest of my life, well, there's no rush, because the rest of my life's a long time, hopefully. And I need to make sure that when I do get there, we're moving towards permanence and habits that establish it. So instead of it going, all right, let's lose this weight in 12 weeks, then work on maintenance, it's more like every step of the way is thinking about implementing new habits, new changes. What are things that I can do to drive my energy intake down that are low-hanging fruit, rather than what's the most effective way to lose the most amount of fat in the next 12 weeks. So I think it really becomes about layering more habits, shifting perspective more. And as one goes through the process of intentional dieting, noticing what's hard, how challenging it is, and then potentially taking time off the diet, and then quote unquote, practicing maintenance in the new body at each point, and the associated behaviors that are going to need to support that. And then another thing I'd say, so doing this in phases, taking time, going through intentional dieting phases and intentional maintenance phases. But I think also having a semi-open-ended goal. So one thing that came out of that same study that I referenced about New Year's resolutioners is that the implementation of SMART goals actually did not improve outcomes, and the group that did not use those specific SMART goals did better. And it's hard to apply causation to the survey-based study, but I can't tell you how many times people have used the SMART goal framework, and it's pushed them towards being very outcome focused and not very process focused. Which actually makes sense if you look where SMART goals came from. They came from like business management practices and managing people in the corporate world. So like X number of sales in X number of weeks makes a lot of sense. But when you talk about X number of pounds in X number of weeks, that's a very kind of pass-fail environment, and it doesn't match up with the realities of life. And if you lose half those pounds in half those many weeks, and your goal is permanent weight loss, how is that not still a win, right? Just keep going, or take a break and do it again, So I think having an openness to the idea of, all right, I kind of I had in my head that I'd get down to, 20% body fat, but I got down to 25%, and that was what I could maintain. And going past that actually started to make me rebound. Maybe I should be okay with that, because I'm already healthy. and I'm only improving. I have this, approach-oriented mindset. It's all extra credit. That'd be a great place to get to. So, how much do I need? How much makes me feel better? How much is not changing my lifestyle to become this kind of restrictive, constant, carefulness with what I do nutritionally and training. So I guess being open to the fact, or not the fact, being open to the possibility that there might be some point along the journey that's not as far as you thought you might get, or maybe it's, further with where you can get to and where you can maintain. And for, taking a more conservative approach, being kind of like a gambler, knowing that people who do diet hard, some of them rebound past where they started. And you see this in bodybuilding all the time. And this is probably coloring my recommendation. Like if a bodybuilder stopped halfway through their diet, they would probably rebound to the same place as if they dieted all the way there, just to show you how the stronger the hunger signals get, the leaner you get, and the more you restrict in the longer time. So I think someone doing it physically and being open to the idea that they may not get all the way where they were planning to go from this already good place, and being open to stopping there if the waters get too tumultuous, I think would probably be the advice I would give someone.
Yeah, well, Eric, you said a lot of great things there, like the whole, if you're doing this for the rest of your life, let's hope that that's a long time. There's no rush. Everyone's like, oh man, I've got to lose all of this weight in 12 weeks. And, the fitness industry is full of the whole like 90-day transformations and 90-day packages and all these things. And you spoke there about dieting phases and maintenance phases. And oftentimes that's kind of packaged up in sort of 6, 8, 12 weeks, depending on how long someone can stay adherent. So I guess that's where they come from. But you're there saying, well, actually, if you're going to be doing this for a long time, we've got data to support approach-based goals, saying let's add things in and let's focus on a place of positivity rather than negativity. So I'm going to transform my body rather than I'm going to lose weight, for example, is a great mindset shift. And that mindset shift away from a time frame and smart goals, I found really, really interesting, because it's that whole, growth versus fixed mindset and that whole process versus outcome. And you can only control the process, right? You can't control the outcome. And actually, even if you look at business management, you're like, oh, X amount of sales and X amount of days makes sense. But really, you can't even control, if someone's listening to this in the corporate setting, you can't control those sales. You can control the amount of calls you make, but you can't control the sales. And it's similar with our bodily transformations. We can control the reps and sets and the days trained and the food we eat, but we can't control the results our body brings us. But what I also wanted to add on to that, Eric, was when you said, if you get to a place that you didn't think would be your final destination, but actually now things start to get difficult, might be time to, knock it on the head or feel like you're happy. I think that's a really cool point, because a lot of people don't understand that the cost of getting really lean. And for some people, genetics again, or sedentary versus very active jobs, that cost is very different.
Yeah. And this is a very tough sell, what I'm saying as well, because what typically now, in the little microcosm of this person who's already done all these awesome things and is exercising and has repaired their relationship with their body and food, it's probably an easier sell. But I think for most people, they're in a position where the decision to diet is this tipping point where they've kind of half dieted for maybe years, and they've wavered back and forth between being okay and accepting where they're at, but really from a very kind of like negative, depressed, like, I guess, acceptance of like this kind of giving in to, I just can't fix this, to then going, no, I can do this. And by the time you decide to pull the trigger and go on a full on diet, you are so frustrated and uncomfortable and unhappy, and in having so much dissonance with the current state you're in, that jumping into something hardcore is the almost inevitable outcome, because you are so ready for action. You've hit that tipping point. And how often do we run into people who kind of have this very black or white, on and off, like they get to that just extreme place of discomfort, go all in, lose a lot of weight, but then push themselves so far that, and they started limping too. When we think about this, they started from a point of already being emotionally compromised and then going hardcore, and then they push themselves to the point of complete breaking, and then that hopelessness comes in. They slide back to where they were, and each time that cycle gets worse, not better. Especially as it's perpetuated by the stuff we talked about that we see in the fitness industry and the messaging. So yeah, what I'm saying is a very hard sell, and there's even data going the other way. There's some data that shows faster weight loss initially in people with obesity is associated with better long-term outcomes.
Yeah.
But I think that's because it provides some hope, and there are going to be some people who succeed. So if you look at that association, yeah, the more you lose initially, but that's how many people are that person? That's a different question mathematically. So I think we have to realize that some of this does start with needing to get into the place that we've described, which allows all these other things to even occur. And that is, we have to break that cycle initially, where I think some of those weight neutral approaches and focusing on exercise are very powerful, focusing on health first, mental and physical, and getting to a more or less clean slate in terms of where you're at, getting the secondary benefits of all that are probably going to include some weight loss, and then moving forward and being open to, and being in the right mindset to be able to do that. Because once you get there, then it's not this constant terrible place of I don't like who I am. But wow, look at all these positive things I've created in my life: a healthy nutrition plan, regular activity. I happen to lose some weight, which shows me that it's possible. And now do I want to take a full bore attack on that? Well, if you do, you do, and you're probably going to be in a much better place and much higher success rate if you were to go down that path. So
yeah, brilliant. Brilliantly said. It's that, like, do the repairing first and then move on through. But it's not as you said, it's the hard sell, because when people get to that point of I want to change, it's like they've usually reached a tipping point. But often that's when they're the most emotionally vulnerable, and a lot of shit's hit the fan, for want of a better word. Because a lot of the time there's a lot of other issues going on as well, and that's where food and lack of fitness and stuff is kind of coming in as a soother and can be really complex. I mean, I think, Eric, my final question to you, because appreciate the time you've given up already and coming up on time on the show. You work a lot with powerlifters, physique athletes, people who either peaking performance or getting very lean. There must be a very complex relationship there, I guess, with the transforming their bodies without letting things go too strict, too disordered. There must be a bit of a kind of recovery phase there. It must be a really kind of difficult seesaw to balance, I guess.
Yeah, all this stuff exists in some kind of bizarre world, different thing where you have to step on a scale to compete in the weight class where you wanted to, or you have 7 strangers look at you mostly naked and then tell you on a 1 to 10 scoring system,
how good you look.
many. Yeah, exactly. So it is people purposefully exposing themselves to like public weigh-ins and public naked viewing, and all in the name of sport, which is why we're nuts. But you layer, so there's a very different pressure. It has this competitive pressure, very sports specific pressure, that can be layered in with someone's experiences in society, or prior eating disorders or things like that. And then on top of that, more often than compared to our current conversation of people, going across the spectrum of body fats, we're looking at getting often incredibly lean in physique sport, and quite lean depending on what weight class you're competing in for strength sport. So you are getting a very different physiological outcome. We start to see the other end of the eating disorder spectrum. If we were talking about, people struggling with repeated binge cycles, or having, a poor body image because they don't like how high they are in body fat. Now we're talking about people on the other end who are dealing with sometimes dysmorphic issues, being incredibly, incredibly lean and wanting to always be that way, or not being able to objectively view how their physique is improved. And it looks a little more like something akin to anorexia. It's not that, unless it is, which it's not completely divorced from physique sport. But yeah, there's a whole thing there. And much like I want someone who is trying to lose weight, who is not a competitor, to be doing it for the quote unquote right reasons, and to be in the driver's seat, for that to be their decision that they put on top of a healthy relationship with food. I want someone to compete for the same reasons, not because they feel this pressure to look a certain way, or their athlete identity is driving them. They feel they must, or that the only way they know how to fix binge eating in the off season is dieting in the in season. So there's a whole other can of worms, which has been, I'd say, the latter half of my career for the last 8 years of trying to focus on great. So we know what the appropriate protein intake is, timing, diet structure, diet timeline, rate of weight loss, all of the quantitative X's and O's. But what about the potential fallout, and what are the rates of eating disorders and body image issues in physique sport? And how do we mitigate that? How do we reduce it? How do we address it when it's there? And how do we ensure that every competitor comes in with informed consent? And then if we are going to get into this place of physiological disruption from extreme dieting and getting very lean, what's the best post-competition season strategy? How do we recover, like you said? How do we get the body back to a place where we might be able to have a normal relationship with our bodies and actually have hunger and satiety signals? Because those, hunger is the only signal left at a certain point in the contest prep diet, and it's not because you're sedentary. It's for other reasons. So that's a whole other can of worms that I deal with all the time.
Well, it's great for us to kind of finish on that note of how you mentioned we've got all that scientific information and quantitative measures of protein, calorie intake, rate of weight loss. We've got all that, but then it's the emotional side of things behind it. We're working with human beings, and we are human beings at the end of the day, and there's that form of consent, driver's seat, solid relationship with food. You're doing this for you. You've got a clear why. You're now applying a diet strategy that will get you to a certain point if you adhere to it, and then it's a case of you're not going to be there forever, and let's recover from this, get back to that normal maintenance. And where does that look like? And it's so complex. And when you're talking with humans, and as I just mentioned earlier in the show, like magazines and social media, where people just seem to be that lean all the time, and it's like, well, they're not. And it's complex.
And they're intentionally not, which I think is some of the reason why I often will point out that fitness models and physique competitors and weight class restricted athletes, they seem like, they are the professionals at losing body fat. I'm not a competitor, but I am someone who wants to be leaner and muscular all the time. Therefore, I should follow what they do. Their dieting strategies, a bodybuilder's dieting strategy, is built around trying to get as lean as possible for a couple months, and then purposely getting back to a body fat level that's much higher than that. So it's a purposeful cyclical diet that you've been struggling to change as an outsider looking in, and you think that you should follow their strategies. Probably not, So I think many times the entire structure of what we do in bodybuilding and for like fitness modeling is the antithesis of what we should be teaching people for what to do.
That's that. Yeah, I mean that's funny, isn't it? As you said, like these people do this for a reason, and then you have regular average Joe and Sally being like, cool, let's follow that so that I can look like that. And it's like, well, actually, health and longevity and being comfortable in your own skin, very different landscape, which is all of what the rest of this podcast has been about. So Eric, another amazing show, if I do say so myself. So thank you for thank you for giving your time again. You mentioned Mass Research Review, which we'll link in the notes. You mentioned 3D Muscle Journey. Is there anywhere else that people can go to find out more about you, what you do?
Yeah, if you're interested in following more like daily stuff, not that I post daily, but maybe weekly, a couple times a week, check me out on Instagram at Helms 3DMJ. But yeah, definitely I'm more focused on the weight class restricted strength sport bodybuilding world. But if that's something you're into, then that's where you can find me.
Well, and you've got a great podcast with Omar Isuf as well, which is just all like weight training obsessed people.
100%. Checks out on Iron Culture. Yes.
Iron Culture. Yeah. So as people get more into their fitness as a standard habit, they can check out that podcast because it's a good mixture of laughs and great information for sure. So
I'm glad to hear it. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you.